Last time, Tesla left us with a question. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. If consciousness is energy, and we spent the whole of last episode building that case, then, what happens to yours when you die? I want to sit with that question today. Let's go there. Let's really go there. But let's do it together. Not avoid it, not dress it up in so much philosophy that we forget what we're actually asking. We are asking, is this it? When the body stops, does everything stop? Does the river just end? Or does it flow into the ocean? Today I want to bring you 3 traditions that have looked directly at this question and found each other on the other side of it. A Christian tradition, a Dutch cardiologist from the scientific tradition, and a Tibetan Lama. All together, the net that stretches across the entire universe. Welcome back to Quantum Awareness. Sound is emptiness, emptiness is sound, where we explore the fascinating intersection of quantum mechanics, neuroscience, and Buddhist philosophy. I'm QP, your quantum preceptor. Before we dive into death, if what we explore here resonates with you, a follow and a like costs nothing, and it tells the universe that you'd like more of this, and I'd be eternally grateful. Well, eternally, how about for the rest of this life? Let's start with the physics, because the physics gives us something solid to stand on before we step into the deepest part of the ocean. The first law of thermodynamics. It's the conservation of energy. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed from one form to another. This is not philosophy, it's not religion. This is one of the most tried and tested, most reliable laws in all of science. Every experiment we've ever run confirms it. Energy transforms. It does not disappear. Now, last episode we built the case that C equals E equals mc squared. That consciousness is not produced by the brain like heat from a fire, something that simply stops when the fuel runs out. That consciousness might be a fundamental form of energy, woven into the fabric of reality itself. Now, if that's true, even partially, even as a serious possibility, then the first law of thermodynamics applies to consciousness too. Your awareness does not disappear when you die. It transforms. Into what? That's what we're going to explore. I want to introduce you to one of the most beautiful ideas in all of Buddhist philosophy, perhaps in all of human thought. The net of Indra. Imagine a vast net, infinite in all directions, stretching across the entire universe. At every intersection of the net, there's a jewel. And every jewel reflects every other jewel. Perfectly, completely, infinitely. When you look into one jewel, you see all the others reflected in it. Kind of like that funny mirror room at the country fair or the exhibition. And in each of those reflections you actually see is you. But in this case, you see the jewel, the original jewel, reflected again and again and again. Infinite reflections of infinite reflections. The whole contained in each part containing the whole. This is the Buddhist version of reality. Everything interconnected, everything interbeing, nothing existing in isolation, nothing lost, ever. Now let's apply this to consciousness and rebirth. If every jewel reflects every other jewel, if your consciousness is not a separate, isolated thing, but a node in an interconnected field of awareness, then when your particular jewel stops shining in this form, it doesn't vanish. The reflection continues. The light moves on. The net remains. This is not a consolation. It's not wishful thinking. It's the logical consequence of taking interdependence seriously. Now, here's something that surprises most people, and I find it genuinely important. Early Christianity had room for reincarnation. Origen of Alexandria, one of the most brilliant and influential theologians of the early church, writing in the 3rd century, taught the pre-existence of souls. He believed that souls existed before birth and would continue after death, potentially passing through multiple lives in a process of spiritual purification and return to God. Did this guy meet the Buddha on vacation to India? Is it okay to laugh at your own jokes? For roughly 500 years, Christian thought had space for something very close to what Buddhism calls rebirth. Then in 553 AD, the Second Council of Constantinople formally condemned the doctrine of the pre-existence of souls. The door was slammed shut, the case closed. The tradition was even declared heretical, and most Christians have no idea that this conversation ever happened at all. And that's not funny in any way. But here's where I keep thinking about. If Christianity, for the first 5 centuries, found space for the soul to have more than one life, then perhaps the question's not as settled as we think. Perhaps what was decided in council rooms by men with political agendas is not the same as what's true. And, another question. Why stop at just three? The Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, the three expressions of one consciousness, one reality? Well, if consciousness can express itself in three, why not 30? Why not 300? Okay, let's get crazy. How about in infinitive ways? I have an idea here. It's easy to control access to three. But infinity? Good luck. I want to tell you about a man named Pim van Lommel. Pim van Lommel is a Dutch cardiologist. He's not a mystic, not a philosopher. He's a medical doctor who spent his entire career resuscitating people from cardiac arrest. People who were, by every clinical measure, dead. No heartbeat, no brain activity, flatline. Beep. And then they came back. And they told him things that had no medical explanation whatsoever. They described floating above their own bodies, watching the resuscitation. They described details of the room, the equipment, conversations between medical staff, details they could not have perceived through any normal sensory channel because their brains were not functioning anymore. Some described moving through a tunnel towards the light. Some described encounters with deceased relatives. Some described a life review, seeing their entire life from the perspective of those that they had affected, feeling what others felt because of them. Wow. Van Lommel didn't set out to study consciousness. He'd set out to understand a medical anomaly, but what he found demanded a completely different framework. In 2001, he published his landmark study in the Lancet, one of the world's most prestigious medical journals. 344 cardiac patients. Prospective, controlled, rigorous. His conclusion was careful but radical. Consciousness cannot be fully explained as a product of brain function. The data simply doesn't support that model. He came to see the brain not as the generator of consciousness, but as the receiver, a transceiver, something that tunes into consciousness rather than producing it. And this is precisely what my Lama taught me. The human brain has 5 or so channels or stations that are tuned into some, but not all of the possible frequencies. Think about this. Dogs, bats, and whale brains are all tuned differently than yours or mine. Dogs hear better than us. Bats see with a special sonar called echolocation that we don't have. And when whales sing, they can be heard thousands of kilometers away. Have you ever heard a real whale song? I have, and I was moved to tears underwater. The radio receiver, or our brain, filters out information that we cannot or do not need to use. Imagine if we had all the different frequencies all at once. We couldn't manage that. So nature gave us this convenient filter that is finely tuned into what's most useful for our species. A Dutch cardiologist and a Tibetan Lama. Different languages, different traditions, different methodologies. And yet when they sat together, they were, as Tesla once said to Vivekananda, talking about the same thing. The receiver metaphor is not new to Buddhism. We talked about it in episode 6. The brain is like a window. Smash the window, the view disappears. But the light that was coming through it, that was never the windows to begin with. Van Lommel arrived at the same window, from the other side. And not surprisingly, he knows my Lama. The two sat down and had a Tesla Vivekananda moment. Now, while Van Lommel looked at consciousness after the moment of death, a man named Ian Stevenson looked at what happened after. Stevenson was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia. He spent over 40 years investigating one specific question. Do children sometimes remember previous lives? He documented over 3,000 cases. Children, mostly between the ages of 2 and 5, so before cultural conditioning had taken hold, who described previous lives in specific, verifiable detail. Names, places, family members, even causes of death. Birthmarks that corresponded to wounds from the previous life. I mean, this stuff's incredible. In many cases, the details were independently verified. People who had never met each other in different countries, different cultures, different languages, describing the same sequence of events from different sides of the same death. Now, Stevenson never claimed proof of reincarnation. He claimed evidence that could not easily be explained by any other hypothesis. His work has been continued by his successor, Jim Tucker, in Virginia, who's added hundreds more cases and refined the methodology even further. So we have Van Lommel showing us consciousness persisting at the moment of death, and Stevenson showing us something, call it memory, call it karma, call it the momentum of life, if you like, appearing from a new form after death. Between them, they're describing the two ends of the bardo. Now, I need to be precise here, because Buddhism says something more subtle than most people realize. Buddhism does not teach reincarnation in the way that Hinduism does. Hinduism teaches that there's an eternal, unchanging soul, the Atman, that transmigrates from body to body. Essentially the same soul moving from one container to the next, unchanged. Buddhism teaches rebirth without a fixed self, which is much stranger and more interesting. Do you remember dependent origination, pratitya samutpada? Nothing exists independently. You're not a fixed, unchanging self. You're a temporary pattern at best. A process, a flow, constantly in the state of change. And when these conditions that support this particular pattern cease, well, the pattern ceases. But the momentum continues. The karma continues. The river flows on. Now, think of a candle. You light one candle from another. Is it the same flame? No. Is it a completely different flame? Also no. But something passed between them. Something continued. But it transformed in the passing. Kind of like in meditation. We dissolve the material world and we build up a new beautiful one with a specific Buddha aspect. And then we transform ourselves into that Buddha, like one new meditator, and each time taking on more of the Buddha's qualities, internalizing them, transforming into them, just like water flowing into water. This is why I said earlier that the river flows into the ocean. It's not that the river disappears. It's not that the river continues unchanged. Something dissolves. Something continues. The water was always the ocean. Now, here's where physics joins the party again. Stephen Hawking spent decades arguing that information falls into a black hole is permanently destroyed. But this would violate quantum mechanics, which insists that information is always conserved. The universe keeps its records. And in 2004, Hawking finally conceded the argument. He acknowledged that information is not destroyed. It's preserved and encoded in the radiation that the black hole emits over time. The universe doesn't lose information. Van Lommel and Stevenson make this connection explicitly in their work. If consciousness is a field, if it is information, not just the product of biology, then quantum mechanics itself suggests it cannot simply vanish. It encodes, it transforms, it persists in forms we don't yet have instruments to measure. The net of Indra and quantum information theory are all pointing at the same thing from different directions. Every jewel reflects every other jewel. Nothing's lost. Everything is held. Of all the traditions that have looked seriously at what happens after death, Tibetan Buddhism has produced the most detailed and specific map. The Bardo Thodol, what we know in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, is not mythology or consolation. It's a precise, practical guide to the states of consciousness that arise between death and rebirth. The word Bardo simply means gap. In between. We actually pass through Bardos constantly. The gap between sleeping and waking, the gap between one thought and the next. Death is simply the largest Bardo, the widest gap, the one that we know the least about. According to the teachings, at the moment of death, Rigpa, or pure awareness, has the opportunity to recognize itself. Do you remember the question from last episode? Am I aware of that which is conscious? If that recognition happens, liberation is possible. If not, the patterns of karma, the habitual tendencies, the unfinished business of this life, pull consciousness back into form, into another life, and into another cycle of samsara. What Van Lommel's patients described, the light, the life review, the sense of vast clarity and peace, the encounter with something that felt like pure love. The Bardo teachings describe all of this, in detail, written down centuries before cardiac resuscitation was even possible. Tibetan lamas were not guessing, they were mapping. And the technology of Vajrayana Buddhism, transmitted intact from teacher to student in an unbroken lineage for over 1,000 years, contains the most precise and extraordinary map of this territory that has ever been produced. Not a philosophy, not a belief system, a technology, tested and refined, and passed directly from mind to mind because that's the only way that it can pass. Within that technology, within what the Kagyu lineage transmits as the 6 yogas of Naropa, there's a precise preparation for exactly this moment. A map. Not of what just happens at death, but how prepared a practitioner meets it. We'll go deeper into that in future episodes. Much deeper. But this is why practice matters. It's not just for this life. For the moment when the gap opens the widest, recognition is everything. The meditator who spent years learning to recognize Rigpa in small gaps, between the thoughts, between the breaths, between sleeping and waking, is really just practicing for the big one. Now, once in a while I get asked this, what do I actually believe about rebirth? So here's my honest answer. I truly believe that consciousness is fundamental. I believe that energy cannot be destroyed. I believe that something like the net of Indra is not just poetry, it's a description of how reality actually works. And I believe that a technology as sophisticated as Vajrayana Buddhism, which has been mapping the nature of mind for over 1,000 years, with the precision of a science, would not have placed rebirth at the very center of its understanding without very good reason. And I believe that when a Dutch cardiologist and a Tibetan Lama sit down together, and they're describing the same territory, that matters. That's not coincidence. That's two rigorous traditions arriving at the same truth from different directions. Exactly what we need more of. Does that mean I know exactly what happens? No. I sit with the uncertainty, kind of the way I sit with a koan. not trying to resolve it, letting it work on me. But here's what I find most compelling. The question itself changes you. The moment you take seriously the possibility that this is not your only life, that the karma you're creating now ripples forward, that the awareness you're cultivating now is a gift to a future form of yourself that you'll never meet, well, something shifts. The urgency of practice becomes very clear. Why meditate? Why do a nundro? Why prostrate 100,000 times? Why sit on the cushion when it's cold and your knees hurt and you'd rather be anywhere else? You do it because the gap opens, and recognition is everything. So today we've asked where consciousness goes. We've grappled with the physics and the conservation of energy, the first law of thermodynamics, and we've understood that what cannot be created cannot be destroyed, only transformed. We've looked into the net of Indra and seen our own reflection looking back. We've discovered that even Christianity for 5 centuries held space for more than one life. We've sat with Pim van Lommel, the Dutch cardiologist, who followed his patients to the edge of death and came back with a completely different understanding of what mind is. And we sat with Ian Stevenson, who found the echo of previous lives in the voices of small children. We looked at the bardo, the gap, and understood that everything we do on the meditation cushion is preparation for the widest gap of all. And we've heard the lineage speak. Naropa, the great Indian Mahasiddha whose teachings became the technology of Vajrayana Buddhism, transmitted through the Karmakaju school, and Milarepa, his lineage brother, the cotton-clad wanderer, who sang the Dharma from cave to cave across the Himalayas, who received the technology and proved what it could do in a single lifetime. Point at what all of this means. River, ripples, and waves. When emerging, arise from the ocean itself. The river doesn't end. It never did. It was the ocean all along. But now a different question arrives. Not where consciousness goes, but what it means to live inside an impermanent form right now. Today, you, in your body, in this life. The physicist has a word for what happens to forms over time. A law, inexorable, one-directional, written into the fabric of the universe itself. Entropy increases. Things fall apart. The arrow of time runs in one direction only. And the Buddha, 2,500 years before the second law of thermodynamics was ever written down, looked at the same reality and called it anicca, impermanence, the first mark of existence. Same observation, completely different relationship to it. Next time on Quantum Awareness, we stand inside the arrow of time and feel it fully. Sickness, old age, death, and loss. The thermodynamic reality of living in a form. And we ask the question that changes everything. Am I my body? Or does my mind have this body as a tool? This is QP. Sound is emptiness. Emptiness is sound. Every question about consciousness is consciousness asking about itself. Catch you next time.